There is a house in London that most people walk past without ever looking up. It stands on a narrow street just off the Strand, a short walk from Charing Cross, close enough to the Thames that on damp nights the air carries the smell of the river up between the buildings. 4 floors of dark brick, plain windows, a doorway that has been painted and repainted so many times that the wood beneath has forgotten its original shape. 36 Craven Street. Between the years 1757 and 1775, this was the London home of Benjamin Franklin. He lived here longer than he lived anywhere else in his adult life. He wrote here, he entertained here, he conducted experiments here that would eventually change the way the world understood electricity and lightning and the invisible forces that move through the air during a storm. And in 1998, during a restoration project meant to save the building from collapse, workers digging in a windowless basement room beneath the back of the house found something that nobody was expecting. Bones. Not one skeleton. Not a single forgotten burial. More than 1,200 fragments of human bone, packed into a pit roughly 1 metre wide, buried beneath the floor of a room that had no windows and only one door. The remains of at least 15 people. Men, women, children. Some of the skulls had been drilled. Some of the long bones had been cut cleanly through with a saw. One was still lodged with the tip of a surgical instrument. The story you're about to hear begins with that discovery, which is entirely real and which you can read about in the published archaeological record. And then it goes somewhere else, somewhere the official record does not follow. Tonight, we're going down into the basement beneath Craven Street. We're going to walk through the verified history first, carefully, brick by brick, exactly as it was documented. And then we're going to step past the last page of that documentation into the version of the story that certain people insist was buried alongside those bones. So settle in, turn the lights low, let your shoulders drop away from your ears. You do not have to stay awake for the ending. You are listening to Sleep Theories. Now, let us begin where I began. With a phone call. My name is Nathaniel Cross. I am a forensic historian. That title means less than it sounds like. It means I spend most of my working life in cold rooms, in archives, in the basements of institutions that have run out of money, reading the handwriting of people who have been dead for 200 years and trying to work out which parts of what they wrote were true. I specialise in 18th century London. Specifically, I specialise in the parts of 18th century London that the 18th century preferred not to write down. Burial practices, anatomy schools, the trade in bodies, the quiet, practical arrangements that allowed a city of 700,000 people to dispose of its dead without ever quite explaining where they had gone. It is not glamorous work. It does not attract crowds. Which is why, on a Tuesday evening in late November, when my phone rang and the screen showed a number belonging to a small museum in central London, I assumed it was about a funding application. It was not about a funding application. The curator on the other end of the line was a woman I'd worked with twice before. She was careful. She was precise. She was the sort of person who chose her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, and she was frightened. She did not say that. She never would have said that. But I had known her for 11 years, and there is a particular thinness that enters a careful person's voice when they're working very hard to sound calm. She asked whether I could come to Craven Street. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I asked what had happened. She said there had been a structural survey. The house is old, and old houses in London are always sinking, always shifting, always requiring some new intervention to keep them standing. Engineers had been checking the foundations beneath a storage room at the rear of the basement level. Routine work. The sort of work that produces a report nobody reads. They had found a void, a cavity behind the basement wall, sealed, unrecorded. Not on any plan, not in any survey, not in any of the extensive documentation that had been produced during the long restoration of the building in the late 1990s. She said the engineers had made a small opening to inspect it with a camera, and then they had stopped work entirely, and then someone had made the decision to call her instead of calling the press. She said the trustees wanted an expert to look at it before anyone else did. She said, and I remember this exactly, because of the strange formality of it, "Nathaniel, I would like you to see this while it is still quiet." I took the last train down. I remember the carriage was almost empty. I remember the rain on the window, the orange smear of the platform lights, the way the city arrived in pieces. I remember thinking that it was probably a cistern. That is the honest truth. On the train, I was already writing the boring version of the report in my head. 18th century houses in that part of London are riddled with sealed voids, old wells, filled coal chutes, drainage runs that were bricked over when the sewers came in, cavities that exist for the profoundly unmysterious reason that at some point, some builder found it cheaper to wall a space off than to fill it in. I have been called to a dozen mysterious voids in my career. 11 of them were cisterns. I want you to remember that I went down those stairs expecting nothing. It matters later that I was not looking for anything. The house at night is not the house you visit during the day. During opening hours, Benjamin Franklin House is a careful, gentle, well-managed place. There are volunteers, there is a soundtrack of period music. There is a performance that walks visitors through the rooms and tells them about the years Franklin spent here, and about the landlady, Margaret Stevenson, and about her daughter Polly, and about the strange domestic arrangement by which one of the most famous men in the Western world lived for nearly 2 decades in 4 rooms of a rented house on a side street. At night, with the lights off and the volunteers gone home, it is simply an old building holding its breath. The floors are original in places. They tell you where you're standing. There is a particular tone to the boards on the first floor landing, a low complaint that I could still identify today. The curator met me at the door with 2 engineers and a site manager. Nobody was making conversation. We went down through the house to the basement level, past the kitchen, past the panelled room, and into the back where the museum stores its overflow. Boxes of leaflets, folded display stands, a vacuum cleaner, the ordinary debris that accumulates in the parts of a historic building the public never enters. They had moved all of it into the corridor. The rear wall of that storage room had been opened in a rough rectangle about the size of a doorway. The brick around the opening was pale, powdery, crumbling at the edges the way old lime mortar does when it has been dry for a very long time. And here is the first thing I noticed, and the first thing that made the evening stop being ordinary. There were 2 walls, not a wall and a void behind it. 2 walls built separately, with a gap of about 40 centimetres between them. The outer wall, the one that formed the visible boundary of the storage room, was consistent with the rest of the basement. Same brick, same bond pattern, same mortar, entirely unremarkable. The inner wall was different brick, denser, better fired, more expensive, laid by someone who knew what they were doing and who was not in a hurry. And here is the detail that I could not stop looking at, the detail I kept returning to for weeks afterward. The inner wall had been rendered on the far side. You do not render a wall you intend to forget. Rendering is finishing. Rendering is a surface meant to be seen and cleaned and lived beside. Somebody had built a room down there, finished it properly, used it, and then, at some later point, walled it off from the world with a second, cheaper wall built specifically to hide the first. The engineers had already told the curator that the cavity extended further back than their camera could resolve. They had also told her that the air inside had been still for a very long time. I asked when we could open it. The site manager looked at the curator looked at me, and there was a pause in that room, a real pause, in which I think all of us understood that we were standing on the last edge of the version of history that we already knew. Then the site manager said, "We can have the rest of it down in about an hour." It took nearer to 2. They worked slowly because the wall was load-bearing at the top and nobody wanted the ceiling of a Grade 1 listed building coming down on them at midnight, brick by brick. Each one lifted out and set on a pallet. The mortar came away almost like dust. I want to describe the moment the last course came out, because I have described it to almost nobody, and because I still do not entirely trust my own memory of it. The room exhaled. That is the only honest way I can put it. There was a pressure difference, a real one, physical and measurable and utterly explicable, and cold air moved out of that opening and across my face and into the storage room, and it smelled of stone and iron and something faintly sweet underneath. 240 years of held breath. One of the engineers laughed. It was a short, embarrassed sound, the noise a person makes when their body has reacted before their mind has caught up. Nobody laughed after that. We put the lamp through first. The chamber was about 5 metres by 4, low ceiling, brick vault overhead, which told me it was original to the house or very close to it. Stone flags on the floor laid tight, worn smooth in a path that ran from the doorway to the centre of the room and nowhere else. That path was the second thing that frightened me. Stoneware's where feet go. A path worn into flagstones is not made by one visit or 10. It is made by the same journey, repeated, by many people, over many years. Somebody had walked from that door to that spot in the middle of the room enough times to polish the stone. And in the middle of the room, at the end of the path, was a chair. It was a heavy piece of furniture. Oak, I thought, and I was later proved right. High-backed, broad-armed, made without ornament of any kind, which is itself unusual for the period, because 18th century furniture of that quality almost always carries some small vanity, some carved edge or shaped foot where the maker signed his work with his taste. This had none. It had been built the way a workbench is built, for a purpose. There were iron fittings at the wrists. There were iron fittings at the ankles. There was a broad hinged band at the chest, and the hinge still moved when I touched it, and that was the moment my hand started shaking, because a hinge that still moves after 2 centuries has been maintained. Somebody had oiled that iron. Around the chair, arranged along the walls, was everything else. There was a bench running the length of the left-hand wall, and on it, laid out in an order that had clearly meant something to whoever left them, were instruments, brass mostly, some steel. I recognised perhaps half of them on sight: electrometers, a pithball apparatus, 2 Leyden jars which are glass containers lined inside and out with metal foil, capable of holding a static charge, and which in the 1700s were the closest thing the world had to a battery. I recognised the rest of them later, from drawings. There were glass vessels on the bench too, and several of them had been scorched. Not broken. Scorched on the inside in a pattern that spidered up the walls of the glass and stopped near the rim. There were notebooks. There was a shelf on the rear wall, running the full width of the chamber, and on that shelf were skulls. I counted 28. I counted them 3 times because the first count did not seem like a real number, and the second count I did not trust, and the third count I performed out loud with the curator standing behind me writing it down. 28. They were clean, prepared, handled with skill. Whoever had processed them had known what they were doing, and had taken care, and that is the part that I have never been able to make peace with, because carelessness would have been easier to understand. Each skull sat on a small wooden block. Each block was numbered, and the numbers ran in sequence, and the sequence had no gaps, and each skull had been engraved, not the block. The bone itself, a tiny mark cut into the frontal bone above the left eye socket, no more than a centimetre across. My first thought was initials. That would have been ordinary. Anatomists in that era did label specimens, sometimes crudely, and initials would have told us something about provenance without telling us anything alarming. They were not initials, they were numbers. 2 groups of numbers separated by a small incised line, each group carried to 3 decimal places. I stood in that cold room at 1 in the morning, with rain moving somewhere far above us on the roof of a house in central London, and I read the marks on the 3rd skull from the left, and I felt the floor of my understanding give way beneath me. They were coordinates, latitude and longitude expressed in decimal degrees, and that is not possible. I need you to understand why that is not possible, because everything that follows in this story depends on it. Latitude in the 1700s was solvable. A skilled navigator could take a sighting of the sun at noon and calculate his latitude with reasonable confidence. That had been achievable for centuries. Longitude was the great unsolved problem of the age. Nations offered fortunes for a solution. Ships were lost, routinely, catastrophically, because a captain could not determine how far east or west he had travelled. John Harrison spent his life building the marine chronometers that eventually solved it, and his fourth timekeeper was tested at sea in 1761, and even then the practical use of that method spread slowly and unevenly for decades. But the deeper problem is not the measurement. The deeper problem is the notation. Decimal degrees, written to 3 decimal places expressed as a pair, is a modern convention. In the 18th century you would have written a position in degrees, minutes and seconds. That is how every chart of that period is marked. That is how every logbook is kept. That is how every single surviving navigational document of the era expresses a location on the surface of the earth. Nobody in 1770 wrote a position the way it was written on those skulls. I photographed every mark. I did it badly, with my phone, with my hands unsteady, and those photographs are the only reason I'm still confident that any of it happened at all. Later, at home, in daylight, with a proper map, I began plotting them. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before I understood what the chamber was, I had to understand what the house had already been accused of. Let us leave the chamber for a while. It has waited 240 years. It can wait a little longer. I want to walk you through the documented history now, because the documented history is genuinely strange on its own, and because you cannot see where the seam is unless you know what the fabric was supposed to look like. Benjamin Franklin arrived in London in the summer of 1757. He was 51 years old. He came as an agent for the Pennsylvania Assembly, sent across the Atlantic to argue a colonial grievance before the British government, and he expected to stay for a few months. He stayed, on and off, for the better part of 18 years. He took lodgings at 36 Craven Street, in the house of a widow named Margaret Stevenson. He had 4 rooms. He had his son William with him at first, and 2 enslaved men, Peter and King, a fact that the polite version of this story tends to move past quickly, and which deserves to be said plainly. And over the following years that house became something remarkable. Franklin was not simply a colonial agent. By the time he arrived in London, he was already one of the most famous scientific minds in the world. His experiments with electricity had been published in 1751. The kite experiment, whatever its precise details, had made his name across Europe. The Royal Society had awarded him the Copley Medal in 1753, its highest honour, before he had ever set foot in their building as a fellow. So the house filled with people, fellows of the Royal Society, instrument makers from Fleet Street, physicians, chemists, political men who wanted a quiet room in which to say something they could not say in Parliament, the great Scottish anatomists, Priestley, who would isolate oxygen, members of the Lunar Society when they came south. 36 Craven Street was, for roughly 2 decades, one of the most intellectually dense addresses in Europe, and it was a rented lodging house on a side street, and almost nobody today knows it exists. Now hold that fact in your hand for a moment, because the conspiracy version of this story does not begin by claiming that anything about the house was false. It begins by pointing out that all of it was true and asking a single question about it. If you wanted a room in the middle of London where the finest experimental minds in the world could come and go at all hours, carrying equipment, staying late, arriving separately, being seen by nobody who would think it worth remarking on, where would you put it? You would put it exactly there. You would put it in the private residence of a beloved public scientist, in a house full of legitimate visitors, on a street that led nowhere in particular, 4 minutes from the river. The reputation was not the cover story. The reputation was the architecture. That is the conspiracy's first move, and I want to flag it clearly, because it is a very good move and it is doing something subtle. It takes a set of entirely verified facts and redescribes their purpose. Nothing has been added, nothing has been falsified, the evidence is identical, only the direction of causation has been quietly reversed. Keep watching for that. It happens again. And then, in 1772, a man moved into the house who changes the shape of everything. His name was William Hewson. William Hewson deserves to be better known than he is. He was born in Northumberland in 1739, the son of a surgeon. He trained in Newcastle, then in London, then in Edinburgh, which at that time was arguably the finest medical school in the world. He came back to London and went to work with the Hunter brothers, William and John, who were the towering figures of British anatomy, and who were, between them, transforming surgery from a trade into a science. Hewson was brilliant. Not merely competent, brilliant. He conducted the foundational research on the lymphatic system, tracing vessels that his predecessors had not been able to follow. He identified the role of what we now call fibrinogen in the clotting of blood. He described red blood cells with an accuracy that would not be improved upon for generations, correcting the shape that earlier microscopists had assumed. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society at the age of 30 and awarded the Copley Medal, the same medal Franklin had received in 1769. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most important scientists in England, and in 1771 he married Mary Stevenson. Polly, everyone called her. She was the daughter of Franklin's landlady. She'd grown up in and around that house. Franklin adored her. In the complicated, avuncular, faintly possessive way he adored a number of clever young women, and he had corresponded with her for years about science and philosophy and the education of her mind. So when Polly Stevenson married William Hewson, the anatomist did not simply become a family friend. He moved in. The Hewsons took the house at 36 Craven Street. Margaret Stevenson moved to another property. Franklin stayed in his rooms, and in that house, William Hewson opened an anatomy school. This is the crucial documented fact, and I want to be extremely clear about it, because it is the foundation of the official explanation for everything that was later found in that basement. Private anatomy schools were legal and common and central to medical education in 18th century London. The problem was that the supply of legal cadavers was almost non-existent. Under the law, the only bodies available for dissection were those of executed murderers, and the number of executed murderers, even in the age of the Bloody Code, was nowhere near the number of bodies required to teach anatomy to hundreds of students each year. So the schools bought bodies from resurrection men, grave robbers, men who worked the burial grounds of the poor and delivered their harvest by night, and who were paid well, and who were not asked questions. 36 Craven Street sits close to the river. There was a wharf at the end of the street in that period. Bodies could be brought up from a boat, into a back door, down into a basement, without ever crossing a lit thoroughfare. Hewson taught there from about 1772. He dissected there. He demonstrated there. His students, perhaps 30 or 40 at a time, worked on human remains in that building, and then, in 1774, he cut himself during a dissection. The wound became infected. There was no treatment. Septicemia killed him within days. William Hewson died on the 1st of May, 1774, at the age of 34 in a house on Craven Street, leaving a pregnant wife, 2 small children, and an anatomy school with no anatomist. That is the historical record. Every word of it is documented, published, and verifiable, and it explains the bones. It explains them completely, in fact. When the pit was excavated in the late 1990s, the assemblage was exactly what you would expect from a teaching anatomy school of that era. Bones from many individuals, mixed. Saw marks consistent with demonstration. Skulls with trepanation, which is drilling, consistent with surgical practice. Cut marks made by skilled hands. Radiocarbon dating and the physical stratigraphy both placed the deposit in the correct window. Buttons and pins and pottery from the period were mixed through the fill. The conclusion of the archaeological team was straightforward, well supported, and almost certainly correct. The remains beneath Benjamin Franklin's house were the discarded material of William Hewson's anatomy school, buried in the basement because burying them was safer than being caught carrying them out. That is the answer. I have spent my career defending answers like that one against people who prefer stories. And I want you to hear me say clearly before we go any further, I still think that answer is correct. The trouble is that it is an answer to a question about a pit in the front basement. It is not an answer to a question about a sealed chamber at the back that no one knew existed, containing a chair with restraints and 28 prepared skulls, and coordinates written in a notation that would not be invented for another 100 years. The notebooks were on the bench, under a folded square of oiled leather, and the leather had done its work. The paper was dry, brittle at the edges, foxed brown in patches, but legible. There were 4 of them. 3 were technical, columns of figures, dates, times, measurements in units I had to look up because they were not standard even for the period. Somebody had been recording something over a span of years, and recording it methodically, and the discipline of it was the most disturbing thing about it. The 4th notebook was different. It was smaller, bound in dark calf, and it was tucked into a shallow recess beneath the seat of the chair. I found it because I had knelt down to examine the mechanism of the ankle restraint, and my hand found the gap. It was a journal, written in a single hand in English, in a script that was educated but hurried, and the author never signed a name. Every entry ends the same way, a single letter. Hey, I have had that handwriting examined by 3 people I trust, independently, without telling any of them what the others had said. It is not Benjamin Franklin. It is nothing like Benjamin Franklin, whose hand is famously round and confident and consistent from youth to old age. It is not William Hewson. We have a substantial amount of Hewson's writing, and the letter forms do not match. It is not Polly Stevenson, or Margaret Stevenson, or William Franklin, or any of the household servants for whom we have samples. Whoever A was, they were in that room, and they were educated, and they left no trace anywhere else in the surviving record of that house. The entries describe meetings. They are dated mostly. They span from the winter of 1762 to the autumn of 1774, which is a period of 12 years, and which ends 5 months after William Hewson died. They describe a gathering that met in that chamber, not every week, sometimes twice in a month, sometimes not for half a year. The attendance is recorded by initials and by profession: physicians, natural philosophers, 2 instrument makers, a man described only as of the house, which in the language of the period almost certainly means a member of Parliament. There is no reference anywhere in the journal to the Royal Society, which is remarkable, because these were, by their descriptions, exactly the sort of men who would have been fellows of it. And one sentence recurs. It appears first in the 3rd entry. It appears by my count 41 times across 12 years, sometimes as a heading, sometimes at the close of a session. Once on a page that is otherwise blank, written 3 times in a column as if the writer were trying to make himself believe it. The current remains after death, now. I want to be careful here, because this is the point at which a responsible historian is obliged to slow down. There is nothing supernatural about that sentence in its own century. The mid-1700s was the great age of electrical enthusiasm. Electricity had arrived as a genuine wonder, and nobody yet knew what it was. It was invisible. It moved instantly. It could be stored in a jar, released at will, made to leap across a gap with a crack and a flash. It killed. It also sometimes revived, and critically, it made dead tissue move. Take a freshly killed frog, apply a charge to the nerve, and the leg kicks. Every natural philosopher in Europe had seen that demonstration. Luigi Galvani would formalise the study of it in Italy, and his nephew Giovanni Aldini would take it on tour, and in the early 1800s Aldini would apply electricity to the corpse of an executed murderer at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, and make the body's eye open and its fist clench in front of a horrified audience. That was not fringe. That was mainstream experimental science, performed in public, reported in journals, and Benjamin Franklin was at the centre of it. Franklin killed birds with electricity to study the effect. He electrocuted a turkey and reported dryly that he had intended to kill it, and had very nearly killed himself instead, and that the flash and the crack were considerable, and that he felt the shock in the back of his neck for some time afterward. Franklin treated paralysis with electricity. He administered shocks to patients who had lost the use of their limbs at their request, and recorded the results, and was honest enough to note that the improvement usually faded, and that he suspected the patients were being helped more by hope than by current. Franklin, along with others, was interested in the resuscitation of the drowned. This was a live question in a port city. The Royal Humane Society was founded in London in 1774, in Franklin's time there, specifically to promote the recovery of people pulled from the water who appeared to be dead, and its methods included, among other things, electrical stimulation. So when a journal from that basement says the current remains after death, the ordinary reading is that a group of serious men were investigating post-mortem electrical response in tissue, which is precisely what serious men of that era did investigate. There is nothing to see here, except that I have read all 4 notebooks now, several times, and the technical volumes are not recording tissue response. They're recording something that has a duration and a decay curve, and that the writer refers to again and again, not as a reaction, as a signal. Here is the passage from the real historical record that I cannot stop thinking about. In 1773, Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter to a French physician named Jacques Barbeau du Bourg. It is a well-known letter. It has been reprinted many times. In it, Franklin describes an observation he says he made concerning flies that had been drowned in a bottle of Madeira wine shipped from Virginia. Poured out into the sun, he wrote, some of the drowned flies dried, stirred, and eventually flew away. And then Franklin writes the sentence that has haunted 3 centuries of readers. He says that he wishes it were possible to invent a method of embalming drowned persons in such a manner that they might be recalled to life at any period, however distant. He says that, having a very ardent desire to see and observe the state of America 100 years hence, he would prefer to an ordinary death being immersed in a cask of Madeira wine with a few friends until that time, and then to be recalled to life by the solar warmth of his dear country. He adds, with the sigh you can hear from here, that in all probability he lives in a century too little advanced and too near the infancy of science to see such an art brought in his own time to its perfection. That is real. You can read it tonight. Most historians treat it as a joke, a wry, characteristic, half-serious flourish from a man who joked about everything, including his own funeral. I have always treated it as a joke too. The journal beneath the chair treats it as a policy statement. Entry after entry returns to the premise, and the premise is this. When a body dies, the machinery stops, but the machinery is not the thing they were interested in. What interested them was the pattern the machinery had been carrying. The writer, A, puts it in 18th century terms, and I will read you their phrasing as closely as I can render it, because the original is convoluted and full of abbreviations. They say, the body is the instrument, and the current is the music, and when the player stands up from the instrument, the music does not cease at once, but persists in the room a while, growing fainter, until the room forgets it. That is not a mechanical claim. That is not a claim about muscle twitch. That is a claim that the electrical activity of a living brain is a pattern, that the pattern is unique to the individual, and that the pattern persists in some detectable form for a period after clinical death. And here is the part that unsettles me as a historian more than anything else in that chamber, more than the chair, more than the restraints. That is not a stupid idea. It is wrong, almost certainly in the form they meant it. But the underlying intuition that the brain has measurable electrical activity, that this activity has structure, that it can in principle be recorded from outside the skull, that its cessation is gradual rather than instantaneous, is broadly correct. And it was not demonstrated until Richard Caton recorded electrical activity from animal brains in the 1870s, and it was not achieved in humans until Hans Berger made the first human recording in the 1920s. The men in that basement were reaching, in 1768, for something that would take science another 150 years to touch. and that is either an extraordinary coincidence of intuition, or they had a reason to believe it that we do not have. The journal numbers its major sessions. They are not experiments in the modern sense, with controls and hypotheses. They are demonstrations. Each one is given a number and a date, and each one is described in a page or two of dense, technical, curiously flat prose. Demonstration 1 is dated the 9th of February 1763. It involves a recently slaughtered pig and a Leyden jar, and the result is described as within expectation. Demonstrations 2 through 9 are variations, different animals, different intervals after death, different arrangements of conductor and jar. The writer records that the response weakens as the interval lengthens, and that it is essentially absent beyond a certain number of minutes, and the number varies, and the variation frustrates them. Demonstration 10 is the first that mentions a human subject, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because the journal is careful about how it says it. It says, of the 10th of November, 1765, that the subject was procured through the usual arrangement, that the interval was under 1 hour, and that the subject was female and of no established connection. Of no established connection. That phrase appears in the journal 14 times. It is the language of the resurrection trade. It means a person nobody would look for. It means the poor, the unclaimed, the workhouse dead, the ones whose graves were shallow, and whose families could not afford the iron cage that wealthier people bought to protect their dead from the men with shovels. It means these were bodies that the 18th century had already decided did not count, and the men in that chamber were using a phrase to make sure they did not have to think about it. I have read a great many documents from the anatomy trade. That phrase is not standard. Somebody invented it deliberately for this journal. The demonstrations continue. 11 through 20 span 9 years. The apparatus grows more elaborate. The intervals shrink, which means they were getting their subjects faster, which means the arrangement was becoming more efficient, which is a thought I have tried not to follow all the way to its end. And then there is Demonstration 21. It is dated the 4th of March, 1772. It is the only entry in the journal that has a title. The title is written in a larger hand across the top of the page, and it says simply, "The First Return." The entry begins normally. The apparatus is described. The room is described. The attendance is unusually high, 11 present, which is more than any other session. The interval is recorded as under 20 minutes, which is the shortest in the entire journal. The subject is recorded as of no established connection, and then the writer describes the arrangement, and the arrangement is different from every session before it, because for the first time the apparatus is not simply delivering a charge, it is listening. They had built something to read. The writer describes an array of coils, a suspended needle, a lamp arranged behind a screen so that the smallest movement of the needle would be magnified as a moving shadow on the wall of the chamber. This is not an absurd design. It is essentially a mirror galvanometer, and instruments of that general kind were genuinely used to detect very small currents in the following century. They were trying to see something too faint to feel. The writer records that the room was darkened, that the charge was applied, that the shadow on the wall moved as expected and returned as expected, and then, 40 seconds later, with no charge applied and no hand on the apparatus, it moved again. The writer records that it moved 3 times. The writer records the interval between the movements, 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds. The writer records that a physician present, whose initials are given, asked a question aloud. And then the page ends, and the next 4 pages have been cut out, not torn. Cut with a blade close to the binding cleanly, by someone who wanted the volume to remain usable. The journal resumes with a 20-second demonstration, dated 11 months later, and the tone of the writing has changed completely. It is shorter, it is colder, it uses the passive voice in places where it previously used the first-person plural. And in the margin of that first page after the gap, in the same hand, smaller, is a line that is not part of the record of the session. It says, "We did not consider that it might answer." I spent the following 4 months in archives. That is the unglamorous heart of this work, not torchlight and cellars, reading rooms, request slips, gloves, the particular ache that settles into your shoulders after the 6th hour of transcribing a hand you cannot quite read. I had a list of initials from the journal, and I set out to identify the members. Some were easy. The instrument makers were traceable through trade directories and through the Royal Society's purchasing records, and both of the men I identified were real, and both made electrical apparatus, and both had documented business with Franklin. The physicians were harder, but not impossible. I matched 4 of the sets of initials to men who were licensed in London during the correct period, whose practices were within walking distance, and whose published interests overlapped almost exactly with the content of the demonstrations. And then I hit the wall. There are, in that journal, 7 sets of initials that I could not attach to any living person. That in itself is not extraordinary. The 18th century swallowed people. Records burn. Parish registers go missing. What is extraordinary is what I found instead. 3 of the 7 matched precisely men who had died before the meetings they were recorded as attending. Let me be specific, without giving you the actual names, because 2 of those families still exist and I have already caused them enough distress. One is recorded as present at 4 sessions between 1766 and 1770. He was a physician of some standing. His will was proved in 1764. There is a monument to him in a church in Hertfordshire with his death date carved into it. I have stood in front of it. Another is recorded as present at a single session in 1769. His death is documented in 1762 at sea, in a well-attested incident with multiple surviving accounts. The third is the one I cannot let go of. He is recorded 11 times, across the full span of the journal, more often than almost anyone. And the only man in London with those initials and that stated profession in that period died in 1759, 3 years before the journal begins, now. I am a historian, and I want to give you the boring explanations first, because they are almost certainly the correct ones, and because I do not think you should take my word for anything. Initials are ambiguous. There were tens of thousands of men in London, and only 26 letters, and a single set of initials with a profession attached is thin evidence at the best of times. Journals are unreliable. Attendance may have been recorded from memory days later wrongly. The dates may be wrong. Datelines in 18th century documents are inconsistent, and Britain had only changed calendars in 1752, and confusion about the year persisted for decades. And the simplest explanation of all, which I believe on most days, the journal is a fabrication. It is not a record of what happened. It is a record designed to look like something, produced by someone for a purpose, perhaps decades after the events it claims to describe. Any one of those explanations dissolves the mystery entirely. But here is what the conspiracy version says, and I am obliged to tell you, because you did not come here for the boring explanation. The conspiracy says the names are not errors. It says the journal was recording attendance accurately, and that some of those attending had died, and that being dead was not, within that chamber, considered a disqualification from attendance. It says that is what the demonstrations were for, and it says that this is the reason the group was never part of the Royal Society, never published, never claimed a discovery, never sought the priority that 18th century natural philosophers fought over like dogs, because they were not a scientific body. The journal gives them a name. It appears only twice, and both times in the earliest entries, as though the writer stopped using it once the habit of secrecy set in. They called themselves the Society of the Returning Spark. The obvious question is why Franklin? The conspiracy's answer is elegant, and I dislike how elegant it is. The ordinary assumption is that a secret group would recruit a famous man because his fame was useful. Access, protection, money. The journal implies the opposite sequence. There are 3 entries, all early, all before 1765, in which the writer refers to the American, and refers to him not as a member, but as an instrument. In one, the writer notes that the American's public work proceeds well, and that the enthusiasm of the continent for his lightning is greatly to our advantage. Greatly to our advantage. The conspiracy reads that as follows. Franklin's public electrical work was not a hobby that happened to coexist with the private work. It was the front of the private work. Every lecture, every demonstration, every published letter about kites and rods and jars did two things at once. It advanced human knowledge genuinely and enormously, and it made the presence of electrical apparatus in that house completely unremarkable. If a neighbour on Craven Street noticed crates of glass and brass being carried down to the basement at odd hours, the neighbour thought, "That is Dr. Franklin and his lightning." If a servant heard a crack and saw a flash under the door, the servant thought, "That is Dr. Franklin and his lightning." If a member of Parliament was seen entering a lodging house on a side street at 11 at night, the explanation was already prepared, and it was true, and it was the greatest cover story ever accidentally constructed, because it was not constructed at all. It grew. The lightning rod, in this reading, is not a metaphor. It is the operating principle. You give the world something bright and loud and high above the house, and everything happening in the basement passes safely into the ground. And there is a second layer to this, which the journal touches on only once, and which I find harder to dismiss than I would like. Franklin, in the documented historical record, was extraordinarily concerned with his own papers. He organised them, he copied them, he worried, in letters, about their fate. And at his death in 1790, an enormous quantity of his correspondence and manuscripts went missing. This is not a fringe claim. It is a standing problem in Franklin scholarship. His papers were dispersed after his death, ended up in multiple hands, and a substantial body of material vanished. Some resurfaced decades later in improbable circumstances. A quantity of his papers is said to have been found generations after his death in a tailor's shop in London, where they were being used to cut patterns from. Historians treat this as ordinary chaos. Estates are messy, executors are careless, paper was valuable and reused. The conspiracy treats it as a clean-up, and it points out correctly that the gap in the surviving record is not random. The years for which Franklin's papers are thinnest are the London years, the Craven Street years, the years covered by the journal. Now, I want to say something here as clearly as I can. Absence of evidence is the favourite food of every conspiracy theory ever constructed. A gap in a record can be made to mean anything, because a gap has no shape of its own, and the human mind will pour whatever it is carrying into any empty container it finds. The papers are missing because paper burns, and executors are lazy, and 230 years is a long time. That is what I would say in a lecture. That is what I would say to a colleague. That is what I said to myself for 4 months, while I sat in reading rooms and tried to explain 28 numbered skulls. Let us go back to the numbers, because the numbers are where this stops being a story about atmosphere and starts being a story about arithmetic. The excavation in the front basement, the one everybody knows about, produced remains that were assessed as representing a minimum of 15 individuals. That figure is a minimum. It is calculated the way all such figures are calculated, by counting duplicated elements. If you have 16 left femurs, you have at least 16 people. It is a floor, not a ceiling, and the true number is always higher and usually unknowable. The journal describes 28 demonstrations. The shelf in the sealed chamber holds 28 skulls. Those two 28s are the reason I could not walk away. Because if the chamber were simply an overflow store from Hewson's teaching school, the numbers would not agree. Teaching material accumulates chaotically. You would expect a jumble, a bin, a mixed deposit of whatever was left at the end of a term. Instead, there is a one-to-one correspondence between a written record of events and a physical inventory of remains, maintained across 12 years, numbered without gaps, arranged in order. That is not a store. That is a set. And there is a further problem, which is the one that keeps me awake, and I have to explain a little archaeology to make it land. When the pit in the front basement was excavated, the assemblage was, as I said, exactly consistent with an anatomy school. But there was a note in the technical report, a single line in a section about skeletal representation that almost nobody has ever remarked upon. The report observed that certain elements were underrepresented relative to what would be expected, specifically that there were fewer cranial remains than the number of individuals would predict. In an anatomy school deposit, skulls should be well represented. They are the most studied element. They are the most frequently prepared. They are also, and this matters, the most valuable, which is why some go missing to private collections. The report noted the shortfall and offered exactly that explanation. Collectors, souvenirs, the ordinary attrition of 200 years. I read that line for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in a reading room, having read it a dozen times before in my career without ever thinking about it for more than a second. And then I thought about a shelf. 28 skulls, prepared and numbered and kept, in a sealed room 40 centimetres behind a wall, while the rest of the bodies went into a pit in the front basement, where anyone digging a drain in 100 years would find them. That is the piece I cannot fit into the ordinary explanation. Because if you are simply disposing of teaching waste, you dispose of it all in the same hole. Somebody separated the heads. Somebody carried them into a different room, cleaned them, numbered them, engraved them, arranged them in sequence, and then built a wall. It took the laboratory 3 weeks to come back to me about the teeth. I had noticed it on the second night, and I had assumed it meant nothing, and I had submitted samples mostly to be thorough. Every skull on that shelf was missing exactly one tooth, the same tooth, the second molar, lower left. In all 28, every other tooth present and accounted for in most cases, allowing for the ordinary catastrophe of 18th century dentistry. Wear, decay, abscess. The population of Georgian London had appalling teeth, and their skulls show it. But the second lower left molar was gone from every single one, and in every case the socket was intact and undamaged, which means the tooth was not lost in life and did not fall out in the ground. It was extracted after death, with care, by someone who did not want to break the jaw. My first assumption was ritual. That is the reflex, and it is usually wrong, and it was wrong here. Ritual practices leave a wider signature. You would expect other modifications, other patterns, some variation across time as the practice drifted. My second assumption was collection, that someone had wanted a token from each subject. The laboratory report ruled out both. Under magnification, the interior of every socket showed the same feature. Small areas of altered bone focal on the walls of the socket, with a texture that the report described as consistent with localized thermal alteration, burning, inside the tooth socket, in a very small, very precise area. The report was cautious about it, as good reports are. It offered alternative explanations, post-depositional staining, fungal action, chemical alteration from something in the fill. But the pattern was identical in all 28, and identical patterns do not come from random processes. So I sat down with an anatomist and asked her a simple question. If someone in the 1700s wanted to introduce a conductor into a human head and wanted the shortest, most direct route to a major nerve trunk without opening the skull, where would they go? She thought about it for less than 5 seconds. She said, the inferior alveolar nerve. It runs through the mandible. It carries sensation from the lower teeth. And the socket of a lower molar sits directly above it, separated by a thin shell of bone that a determined person with a fine instrument could pass through in a matter of minutes. It is, she said, essentially a doorway. Modern dentistry uses that same anatomy every day, from the other direction, to deliver anaesthetic. They were not collecting teeth. They were making an access point, and that reframes everything, because it means the demonstrations were not surface applications. They were not putting a charge across a corpse and watching a limb jump, which is what everybody in Europe was doing and which explains nothing unusual at all. They were placing a conductor into direct contact with the peripheral nervous system and running it inward toward the base of the skull. They were trying to reach the brain from the inside. The report also gave me the one piece of information I had asked for without expecting an answer, and it is the piece I have never published, and the reason I have never published it is that I do not have a good explanation for how anyone would have known to do it. The alteration in every socket was on the same wall. The medial wall, the one closest to the midline of the body, which is the correct side, which is where the nerve actually runs. Somebody in that basement, decades before the nervous system was mapped in anything like modern terms, knew precisely where to aim. I went back into the chamber alone, in February, with permission that I am fairly sure the curator did not have the authority to give me. I wanted the floor. The path worn into the flagstones had been bothering me since the first night, because it ran from the door to the chair and stopped there, and that made sense. But there was a second, fainter wear pattern that ran from the chair toward the rear left corner, and then stopped at nothing. A worn path that leads to a blank wall means that the wall was not always blank. I lifted 3 flagstones. It took most of an afternoon. Under the third one, set into the packed earth and covered with a slab of slate, was a lead-lined box about the size of a folio volume. Inside it was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and nothing else. The paper is heavy laid stock with a watermark I have traced to a Kentish mill operating in that period. The ink is iron gall, standard for the era, and its degradation pattern is consistent with age. It is unsigned. It is addressed, in a line across the top, to whoever opens this room. And the handwriting is Benjamin Franklin's. I have had it examined by 2 document specialists. Neither knew the provenance. Both said the same thing in different words. The letter forms, the spacing, the characteristic terminals, the way the writer joins certain pairs, all consistent with authenticated Franklin exemplars from the 1770s. Neither would state it as a certainty, because no responsible examiner ever does. Both said it is either his hand or the work of a forger of remarkable skill and remarkable patience who buried their forgery under a flagstone in a room that had been sealed for over 2 centuries and would not be opened in their lifetime, or in their children's, or in anyone's they could have imagined. I will read you what it says. I have the transcription in front of me. I've modernised the spelling but changed nothing else. It begins without greeting. If this room has been opened, then the wall has failed, and I am long past caring what is said of me. We began in the belief that we were studying the animation of matter. That was the whole of our ambition. We wished to know by what agency the living differ from the dead, and we supposed the answer to be a species of fire, and we supposed that a sufficient understanding of that fire would place the recovery of the drowned and the strangled and the newly fallen within the reach of ordinary practice. That was a good ambition. I hold to it still. Many will be saved by it. But we did not find a fire. We sought to understand life. Instead, we discovered memory. And then there is a gap of 2 lines, and the hand becomes smaller and more crowded, and the letter continues. I set down here what I have not written elsewhere and shall not. Every living creature carries in itself a current, and the current is not uniform, and its irregularities are not noise but signature. Each is particular. Each differs from every other as one face differs from another. I have satisfied myself of this beyond the reach of doubt. At the ceasing of the body, this current does not extinguish as a flame is snuffed. It diminishes. There is an interval. In that interval the signature persists, growing weaker, and it may be detected, and being detected it may be disturbed, and a thing that may be disturbed may be addressed. We addressed it. I record no more of that here. Those who are present require no reminder, and those who are not are better served by ignorance. I say only this. We had believed we would find, at the end of a man, an absence. We found instead a diminishing, and we had not asked ourselves before we began what obligation is owed to a diminishing thing, nor what such a thing might want, nor whether the asking of a question is a kindness. I am an old man now, and I have made a study of my errors, and this is the greatest of them. Seal the room, Do not repeat the 21st. If you are of a scientific temper and cannot be persuaded, then I ask only that you begin as we did not, by determining first who it is that you are calling. Determine first who it is that you are calling. I had been carrying the coordinates around for months by then. I had plotted them the week after the chamber was opened, on a laptop at my kitchen table, expecting nothing, and I had not known what to do with the result, and so I had done what people do with results they cannot use. I'd put them in a folder and stopped looking at them. 28 pairs. Latitude and longitude, decimal degrees, 3 places. 27 of them fall within Greater London. They are spread across the city, north and south of the river, with a slight concentration to the east. They do not form a shape. They do not spell anything. They do not sit on a ley line or a grid or any of the other patterns that people find when they want to find patterns, and I checked, because I am not immune to wanting. They sit on burial grounds, not the great ones, not the cathedrals or the fashionable churchyards where merchants bought their vaults. They sit on the burial grounds of the poor, the overflow yards, the plague pits reopened for parish use, the unconsecrated corners where the workhouse dead and the drowned and the unnamed were put into the ground 4 deep because there was nowhere else to put them. Several of the locations are now buildings. 2 are under a railway, 1 is a car park, 1 is a small public garden with a bench in it, and I have sat on that bench, and there is nothing there, and there was never anything there, and 500,000 people walk past it every year. Every one of those sites was in use during the period covered by the journal. Now here is where the ordinary explanation still works, and I want to give it to you fairly. If you are running an anatomy operation supplied by resurrection men, you would want to keep a record of where your material came from. It would be practical. It would tell you which grounds were productive and which were guarded. It would be, in the coldest possible sense, inventory management. That explains 27 marks perfectly. It does not explain the notation, which is wrong for the century by 100 years, and it does not explain the 28th. The 28th skull sits at the end of the shelf. It is the largest. It is the only one with any damage, a healed fracture above the right orbit from some injury years before death. Its coordinates are not a burial ground. They are 36 Craven Street, to 3 decimal places, which at that latitude is a resolution of roughly 100 metres. They are the house, not the street, not the parish, the building we were standing in. I have checked that against every historical map I can find, and there is no burial ground at that location, and there never was, because the land is reclaimed river frontage that was not built on until the 1600s, and was open water before that. So here is the conspiracy's final claim, and it is the one that I have not been able to argue my way out of at 3 a.m. It says the marks are not labels. It says the marks are answers. It says the men in that chamber over 12 years refined a method until they were able to put a question to something that persisted for a few minutes after the death of a body, and that the question they eventually learned to ask was the simplest one available, the one you ask a person you cannot see. Where are you? And it says that 27 times they received in reply a position corresponding to a hole in the ground in London where a body had been left, and that they engraved it on the skull because they had no other way to file it. And it says that on the 28th attempt, the 4th of March, 1772, the demonstration they title The First Return, something answered that did not give the location of a grave. It gave the location of the room, which is not an answer to where are you. It is an answer to how close am I. William Hewson died on the 1st of May, 1774. The journal records demonstration 28, its last, on the 19th of October of that year, and then it stops, not with a conclusion, not with a summary. The remaining pages of the volume are blank, and the blankness of them is somehow worse than an ending would have been. Benjamin Franklin left London in March of 1775. He left in a hurry, and for entirely documented reasons, because the political situation between Britain and the American colonies had collapsed, and he had been publicly humiliated in the cockpit at Whitehall the previous year, standing silent for an hour while the Solicitor General tore into him in front of an audience of laughing lords. He sailed for Philadelphia. Within weeks of his arrival, the shooting had started at Lexington and Concord. He never came back to Craven Street. The house passed to other tenants. Polly Hewson stayed in touch with Franklin for the rest of his life, and eventually moved to America to be near him, and was with him when he died in 1790. And in the years between, according to the conspiracy, the room was closed. There is a documented event that the theory attaches itself to, and I want to describe it accurately. Franklin's papers, as I mentioned, were dispersed after his death, and a considerable body of manuscript material has never been recovered. That is a real and long-standing problem in the scholarship. There is also a documented fire. In 1812, a warehouse fire in London destroyed a quantity of stored papers belonging to an estate connected, at a distance, to one of Franklin's London associates. This is a real event with a real record. Insurance documents survive. The contents are described only in general terms, as is normal. The conspiracy says the papers were not lost. It says the society, or what remained of it, spent 40 years retrieving what had been written and destroying it, and that the fire was the end of that process rather than an accident within it, and that the last act was to build a second wall in a basement on Craven Street and let the house forget what was behind it. And it offers, as evidence, the one detail from that chamber that I still cannot explain and have stopped trying to. The inner wall was rendered on the far side, as I told you, finished, lived beside. The outer wall, the concealing one, was built with brick that does not match the house. I had a sample analysed. The composition and the firing profile are consistent with London stock brick of a later period than the surrounding structure. The best estimate the laboratory would give me was a range, and the range was the first quarter of the 1800s. Somebody sealed that room roughly 40 years after the last entry in the journal, which means that for 40 years somebody knew it was there and left it open, and then, at some particular moment, for some particular reason, decided that it should not be open anymore, and they oiled the hinge before they went. I want to say something about the cover story, because I think it is the most interesting idea in this entire theory, and because it is the part that has changed how I read every official explanation I encounter. When the bones were found in 1998, the press ran the story the way you would expect. Benjamin Franklin, body in the basement, founding father, mystery. It was a good week for headline writers, and then the archaeologists did their work carefully and produced an explanation that was accurate, well evidenced, and profoundly deflating. Anatomy school, William Hewson, ordinary practice for the period. Nothing to see here. That explanation is almost certainly true. I have said so twice already, and I will say so again. But notice what a true explanation does. It closes the question. Once the public has an answer that fits, and the answer is dull, nobody asks a second question. The story leaves the news cycle. The file is marked resolved, and every subsequent oddity that turns up in that building gets measured against the answer that already exists, and if it fits, it is absorbed, and if it does not fit, it is set aside as anomalous and left for someone else. The conspiracy's claim is not that the anatomy school explanation is a lie. Its claim is far more uncomfortable than that. It says the anatomy school was real, and the bones in the front basement were exactly what the report says they were, and the explanation was allowed to stand precisely because it was true, and because a true explanation is the most effective concealment ever devised. You do not need to fabricate a cover story if the building is already full of a perfectly good one. You only need to make sure that the true thing is discovered first, and that it is sufficient. I have thought about that a great deal. I think about it when I read official statements now. I think about it when a report closes a question cleanly, and I feel that small relief of a loose end being tied, and I have learned to notice that relief, because relief is when I stop looking. The most effective way to hide something is not to bury it under a lie. It is to bury it under a fact. There was one more thing in that room, and I have been putting off telling you about it. The rear left corner, where the second worn path ended, was not a wall. It was a collapse. At some point, probably long ago, a section of the vault at the back of the chamber had come down, and the rubble had settled, and the settled rubble had looked, in lamplight, on a cold night, exactly like a wall. The engineers cleared it in early March. It took 4 days, and it produced a space perhaps 2 metres deep, an alcove, and in that alcove was the apparatus. I do not have a good word for it. It is an array, a frame of oak, roughly 2.5 metres across, supporting concentric rings of copper coil, hundreds of turns. The wire is hand-drawn, which you can see under magnification from the irregularity of the gauge, and the insulation is silk, wound by hand, and I have tried to estimate the labour involved in producing that much insulated wire in the 1700s, and the number I keep arriving at is measured in months. The rings surround a low wooden platform. There are leads running from the array, 4 of them. They are heavy, and they are shielded, and shielding is not something an 18th century experimenter would ordinarily bother with, because there was no ambient electrical noise to shield from, unless what you're trying to protect is not the apparatus from the room, unless it is the room from the apparatus. 3 of the leads terminate in clamps. The 4th runs across the floor, through a channel cut into the stone to the base of the chair, to the restraint at the chest, and bolted to the frame of the array at eye height is a brass plate. It is the only decorative element in the entire chamber. Someone paid to have it engraved properly by a professional, in a good hand. It carries 1 sentence. Memory requires a conductor. I have looked at that plate for a very long time. I have photographs of it on my phone that I open more often than I should, because a plate like that is not a note to oneself. You do not commission engraved brass for a private reminder. A plate like that is a statement of purpose, fixed to the front of an instrument, in a room where people gathered, so that everyone entering would see it and understand what they had come to do. It is a motto. It is the kind of thing an organisation puts on its equipment, and it answers, in 4 words, the question I had been circling for months, which was why they went to such lengths to reach the nervous system, rather than simply passing current through the body. They did not believe the signal travelled through space. They believed it required a path, a physical medium, something to run along, the way a current runs along a wire, the way lightning runs down a rod into the ground. And they had built an apparatus with 4 leads, 3 for the subject, and 1 running across the floor into the chair, into the chest of whoever was sitting in it. They were not only reading, they had built a receiver, and the receiver was a person. On the 11th of March, electricians came down to install permanent lighting in the chamber ahead of a formal survey. I was there. I had no reason to be there. I told myself I was supervising. They ran a temporary supply from the consumer unit in the corridor, and they were working near the alcove because that was where the last fitting was going, and at some point in the afternoon one of them set a cable reel down on the floor beside the array. I want to be extremely clear about what happened next, because I have gone over it perhaps 1,000 times, and I have an explanation for every part of it. A coil of insulated copper wire sitting in the changing magnetic field of a live cable will develop a current. That is induction. It is how transformers work. It is how the charger for your phone works. It is not mysterious, and it is not rare, and if you put an old coil next to a modern electrical supply, you should expect exactly this. The array made a sound, not a spark, a hum, low and steady, and it came up through the stone floor rather than out of the air, and I felt it in the bones of my feet before I heard it. One of the electricians swore and kicked the reel away, and the hum stopped. That was the whole event. Perhaps 4 seconds. Entirely explicable. Everybody laughed the way people laugh in old buildings. I had a recorder running. I always have a recorder running. It is a professional habit. In archives you dictate rather than write, because writing is slow and your hands are occupied, and after 20 years I do not think about it any more than I think about breathing. I listened to that afternoon's audio 3 days later at home transcribing notes. The hum is on the recording. It sounds exactly like what it was, a 50 Hz induction hum, and it lasts 3.5 seconds, and underneath it, in the last second, there is something else. I am not going to tell you it is a voice. I have had it analysed. I paid for it myself. The analyst was given no context and asked one question, which was whether the audio contained any signal of vocal origin. Her report says the following: that there is a modulated component at low amplitude, that its formant structure is not inconsistent with human speech, that the recording quality is far too poor for any determination to be made, that mains hum frequently produces artifacts that the human auditory system will interpret as speech, because the human auditory system will interpret almost anything as speech, and that in her professional judgment no conclusion of any kind can responsibly be drawn. That is the correct answer. That is the answer I would have given. I have listened to it several hundred times. The first 50 times I heard nothing but hum. And then, the way it always happens, the way it happens with every piece of ambiguous audio anyone has ever obsessed over, I heard something, and once I had heard it I could not unhear it, and now it is the only thing on the recording. 3 syllables, down and low and worn out, coming up through a stone floor in a room where somebody 240 years ago wrote in a margin that they had not considered that it might answer. Seal it again. That is what I hear. I am aware of exactly what that means about me. I know that I am a man who spent 4 months alone in an archive reading a dead person's handwriting and then heard a request in a mains hum. I know that pareidolia is the most reliable phenomenon in the entire study of perception. I know that the analyst is right, and that the recording is worthless, and that I would tell any student of mine to throw it away. I have not thrown it away. And I have never gone back down those stairs. I submitted my report in June. It was 91 pages. It was, I think, the most careful document I have ever produced. I described the chamber, the construction sequence, the dating of both walls, the furniture, the instruments, the 28 skulls, the engraved marks, the dental modification, the laboratory findings, the 4 notebooks, the letter beneath the flagstone, and the array. I made no claims. I want that on the record. I offered the ordinary explanation for every single element, and I offered it first, and I only noted the places where the ordinary explanation was strained, and I ended with a recommendation that the material be transferred to an institution with the resources to study it properly. I heard nothing for 6 weeks. Then the museum published a short statement. It said that recent structural works at Benjamin Franklin House had identified a previously unrecorded void within the basement fabric, that the void had been assessed, that it was consistent with a filled service or storage space of the type commonly encountered in buildings of this date, and that it had been recorded and stabilised. That is the whole statement. 94 words. I have counted them. There is no mention of a chamber or a chair or an inventory of human remains, or a letter in a lead-lined box, or 200 kilograms of hand-wound copper coil. My name does not appear in it. I wrote to the trustees. I received a courteous reply thanking me for my contribution, and explaining that the matter was under review, and that further comment would be inappropriate at this stage. I wrote again in September. I did not receive a reply. In October I went to Craven Street as a member of the public, and bought a ticket and took the tour with 11 other people, and it was excellent, and the actress playing Polly Hewson was very good indeed. At the end I asked, in the way a curious visitor asks, whether it was true that there had been more work in the basement recently. The guide said yes, there had been some structural repairs. She said it very naturally. I am confident she believed it. I am not going to tell you that I was silenced. Nobody threatened me. Nobody visited my office at night. What happened to me is the thing that actually happens, which is much quieter and much more effective. A committee decided that a finding was too anomalous to announce and too expensive to investigate, and so it was recorded and stabilised and set aside for someone else at some later date, when there is funding. That is how nearly everything is buried. Not by conspiracy, by deferral. I had almost made my peace with it. In January, a package arrived at my department. No return address. Posted in central London, second class, in a padded envelope of the kind sold in every corner shop in the country. Inside was a single sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve. It is a page from a notebook. The paper stock, the ruling, and the binding damage along one edge match the volumes from the chamber exactly. The cut along the left margin is clean and was made with a blade. It is one of the 4 missing pages from demonstration 21. The body of the page is a technical record, timings, the behaviour of the needle, 3 columns of figures that I have not yet been able to interpret and that I have shown to 2 physicists, both of whom asked me questions I could not answer about how the data was gathered. Across the top, in the same hurried hand that signed itself A, in ink that has faded to the colour of weak tea, is a line that was written after the entry, because it sits above the ruling and crowds against the edge. It says, Craven Street was only the first laboratory, and beneath the columns of figures in the bottom margin there is a list. Paris, Edinburgh, Philadelphia, Vienna, 4 cities, each written on its own line, each one struck through with a single ruled stroke of the same ink, except the last. I have spent 7 months trying to work out what the strokes mean, whether crossed out means closed, or means completed, or means something I have not thought of, and I have spent 7 months looking at the one city on that list that nobody drew a line through, and knowing that in that city there is a building, and that somewhere in that building there is very probably a wall that does not appear on any plan. I am not going to go and look. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think you deserve better than a heroic ending. It is not because I am frightened of what I would find. Most of me does not believe there is anything to find. Most of me believes exactly what the report says, which is that an anatomist ran a school in a basement, and that the rest of it is a very old, very elaborate, very patient hoax constructed by somebody with more time and imagination than I have. It is because of one line in a letter under a flagstone, written by a man who was, by every account of everyone who ever met him, one of the most curious human beings who has ever lived. A man who flew a kite into a thunderstorm. A man who joked about being pickled in wine so that he could wake up in a better century. That man wrote, "Seal the room." If Benjamin Franklin looked at something and decided it was better not known, I am not sure I want to be the person who disagrees with him. So here is where we leave it. The house is still there. It is open most days. You can walk through the rooms where Benjamin Franklin lived for 18 years, and stand at the window he stood at, and look down a narrow street toward a river that has been moved and embanked and built over so many times that he would not recognise the view. The bones are real. That is not in dispute by anyone. More than 1,200 fragments, at least 15 people, in a pit beneath a windowless room, and the explanation for them is almost certainly an anatomy school run by a gifted young surgeon who died at 34 from a cut on his finger. History remembers the remains beneath Benjamin Franklin's home as the residue of anatomy lessons. According to the conspiracy, they were the last surviving traces of an experiment so dangerous that even the Age of Enlightenment, which was afraid of almost nothing, chose to bury it beneath its own foundations. I do not know which of those is true. I know that there is a room under a house in central London with a chair in it, and that somebody kept the hinges oiled, and that the wear in the flagstones runs from the door to the middle of the floor and stops. And I know that whatever else that path means, it means that people went in, over and over, for years. Sleep well tonight. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and others like it, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us and helps others discover these mysteries. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. If you enjoy this content and want more stories like this, consider subscribing. Now, let's get into tonight's mystery. A massive thank you to Mittal Patel for suggesting this story. This one's for you. There are places on Earth where the ground itself whispers questions that history refuses to answer. In the spring of 2005, a man stood in a valley in Bosnia and Herzegovina, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Not there. Not shaped like that. Not aligned so perfectly with the cardinal points of our planet. The Visoko Valley had witnessed centuries of human history. Roman settlements, medieval fortresses, Ottoman occupation, the Yugoslav wars, layer upon layer of civilization, each one leaving its mark on the landscape. But beneath all of it, buried under soil and vegetation and the passage of countless generations, something else waited. The locals called it Vysochika Hill, a natural formation, a geological coincidence. Nothing more than compressed sediment and ancient stone shaped by millions of years of wind, water and time. Children played on its slopes. Farmers grazed livestock at its base. It was part of the landscape, unremarkable and familiar. But this man, standing at its base with a surveyor's eye and a researcher's curiosity, saw something different. He saw edges too sharp to be accidental, surfaces too flat to be random, angles too precise to be the work of erosion alone. Where everyone else saw a hill, he saw geometry. Where they saw nature, he saw intention. He saw 4 triangular faces rising from the earth like a monument deliberately placed. He saw corridors carved into bedrock, running for miles beneath the valley floor. He saw alignments that matched the great structures of Egypt, Mexico and China with impossible accuracy. He saw what he believed was the largest pyramid on Earth, buried and forgotten, older than any civilization in our textbooks, larger than Giza, older than Mesopotamia, hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. And when he announced his discovery to the world, he didn't just challenge geology, he challenged everything we think we know about who built what, when they built it, and what came before the history we've been taught. He challenged the timeline of human civilization. He challenged the idea that ancient Europeans were primitive, living in small tribes while Egypt and Mesopotamia flourished. He challenged the gatekeepers of accepted history, and they challenged him back. This is the story of the Bosnian pyramids, a mystery written in stone, a theory that refuses to die, a battle between belief and skepticism that continues to this day, and a question that still echoes through the Visoko Valley, unanswered and unsettling. What if the oldest civilization in Europe wasn't recorded in any book, but hidden beneath the ground we walk on? What if everything we've been taught about the progression of human development is missing a chapter? And what if that chapter was deliberately forgotten? Chapter 1. The Man Who Challenged History. Semir Osmanagic was not supposed to change archaeology. He was a businessman, an author, a man with degrees in political science and metallurgy, not ancient history. He had built a successful life in Houston, Texas, far from the land of his birth. He owned companies, he wrote books, he lived comfortably in the practical world of commerce and industry. But he had always been drawn to mysteries. For years he had travelled the world studying ancient civilizations. He visited pyramids in Egypt, standing in the shadow of Giza, and feeling the weight of millennia pressing down on the sand. He explored the stepped temples of Mexico, climbing the pyramids of Teotihuacan, and wondering about the people who built them without metal tools or the wheel. He trekked through Peru, examining the precise stonework of Machu Picchu and the massive blocks of Sacsayhuaman, fitted together so perfectly that a knife blade couldn't slip between them. He travelled to China, documenting the pyramids there that few Westerners even knew existed. And everywhere he went he saw patterns, the same architectural principles, the same astronomical alignments, The same massive scale and impossible precision. Cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all building the same thing. He wrote books proposing that these similarities were not coincidental, that ancient civilizations were connected by knowledge we'd lost, that human history was deeper and stranger than the textbooks admitted. His books were popular in certain circles, controversial in others. Mainstream archaeology dismissed him as a fringe theorist, someone who saw connections that weren't there and ignored evidence that contradicted his views. He was used to skepticism. But in 2005, when he returned to his homeland of Bosnia and Herzegovina after years abroad, something changed. He wasn't visiting ancient ruins this time. He was just driving home. It was supposed to be a simple trip through the Visoko Valley, about 20 miles northwest of Sarajevo. A quiet agricultural region, known for its medieval fortress and leather industry. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would appear in guidebooks or attract tourists. But as he drove, something caught his attention. The hills, specifically their shape. Osmanagic had spent enough time looking at pyramids to recognise certain characteristics. Most hills are irregular, rounded by erosion over millions of years, asymmetric, chaotic in their contours, no two sides the same. These were not. Vysočicka Hill rose from the valley floor with 4 distinct faces, each one angled, each one sloping at what appeared to be a consistent grade. The summit formed a flattened plateau, not a rounded peak. The sides descended in clean geometric lines toward the base. From a distance, it looked like a pyramid. A massive pyramid covered in earth and vegetation, but a pyramid nonetheless. Osmanagic pulled over. He got out of his car and stood at the side of the road, staring up at the formation. Other drivers passed by, locals who'd seen the hill their entire lives and never thought twice about it. But Osmanagic couldn't look away. He walked closer. He circled the base, noting the angles, the orientation, the way the faces aligned with the cardinal directions. He made sketches in a notebook. He took photographs from different positions. And the more he looked, the more convinced he became. This wasn't a hill. It was a structure. Over the following weeks, he returned again and again. He brought surveying equipment. He took measurements. He compared the angles to pyramids he'd studied in Egypt and Mexico. The slope angles averaged at around 45 degrees, the same angle used in many ancient pyramids. The faces pointed north, south, east, and west with remarkable precision. The same cardinal alignment found at Giza. He measured the base dimensions. If this was indeed a pyramid, it would be enormous, over 12,000 feet along each side, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, larger than any structure built by ancient humans, the largest pyramid on Earth, hidden in Bosnia. Osmanagic knew what he was suggesting was extraordinary. He knew the implications. He knew the response he would get. But he also knew he couldn't ignore what he was seeing. In October of 2005, he held a press conference. Media from across Bosnia attended, curious about what this businessman turned researcher was claiming. He stood before them and made his announcement. Vysočicka Hill was not a hill at all. It was a pyramid. He called it the Pyramid of the Sun, and he claimed it could be older, much older, than the pyramids of Egypt. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some people laughed, dismissing it as pseudoscience or a publicity stunt. Others were intrigued, excited by the possibility that Bosnia might hold secrets worthy of global attention. The local government saw opportunity, tourism, international interest, a chance to put Visoko on the map and bring money to a region still recovering from the devastation of war. They gave Osmanagic permission to excavate. Within months, volunteers from around the world descended on the valley. Archaeologists, engineers, geologists, and curious believers with shovels and enthusiasm. Cameras arrived, documentaries were filmed. Journalists from major publications flew in to cover the story. The small valley town of Visoko, population 20,000, became the centre of a global controversy. But the controversy didn't start with Osmanagic's announcement. It started with what his team found when they began to dig. Chapter 2. The measurements that raised eyebrows. From the very beginning, Osmanagic understood that belief alone wouldn't convince anyone. He needed data, numbers, measurements that could be verified and reproduced. Subjective interpretation wouldn't be enough. He needed objective evidence that could stand up to scientific scrutiny, so his team brought in professionals, surveyors with decades of experience in topographical mapping, civil engineers who understood structural analysis, geologists who could differentiate between natural formations and artificial construction. They used laser theodolites to measure angles with precision down to fractions of a degree. They employed satellite imaging to map the overall structure from above. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the surface without disturbing the soil. What they found was difficult to dismiss. The slope angles of the hill's four faces measured consistently around 45 degrees. Not exactly uniform across every inch of surface, but far more regular than what natural erosion typically produces. In nature, hills erode unevenly. Water carves gullies, wind shapes ridges. One side weathers faster than another depending on sun exposure and prevailing weather patterns. But all four faces of Vysotseka showed similar angles of inclination. The orientation of the structure was even more striking. Using magnetic compasses and GPS coordinates, the team determined that the four faces aligned almost perfectly with true north, south, east, and west. Not magnetic north, which shifts over time and varies by location, but true north, the axis around which Earth rotates. Cardinal alignment, the same kind of precision found at the Great Pyramid of Giza, which points north with an error of less than 1/10 of a degree. The same alignment used at the pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico, where the Avenue of the Dead runs precisely 15½ degrees east of north, matching the orientation of the setting Pleiades constellation. Ancient builders across the world had encoded astronomical knowledge into their monuments. They had aligned their structures with celestial phenomena, creating buildings that functioned as calendars, observatories, and ritual spaces tied to the movements of stars and planets. If Vysotseka was artificial, it fit that pattern perfectly. Osmanagic's team also measured the base dimensions. Using GPS mapping and aerial photography, they calculated the footprint of the structure. The numbers were staggering. If this was indeed a pyramid, each side measured approximately 12,000 feet from corner to corner. That's over 2 miles per side. Footprint covering roughly 75 acres. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza has a base measuring 756 feet per side. Vysotseka, if artificial, would be nearly 16 times larger along each edge. The volume of such a structure would be almost incomprehensible. Millions of cubic meters of stone and earth, shaped and positioned with geometric precision. If humans built this, it would represent an engineering achievement beyond anything in recorded history. But there was a problem. A big problem. Geology. Geologists examining the hill identified it as a formation composed of layered conglomerate rock, sandstone, and claystone, the kind of sedimentary deposit common in river valleys and ancient lake beds. Material that forms naturally when rivers carry sediment downstream, depositing it in layers over millions of years. The rock wasn't quarried granite or limestone. It wasn't shaped blocks fitted together. It was layered sediment, compressed, and hardened into stone by geological processes. They argued that the triangular shape, while unusual, could be explained by natural processes. Tectonic uplift pushing the formation upward at an angle. Differential erosion, where softer layers weather away faster than harder ones, creating flat faces along natural cleavage planes in the rock. They pointed to other hills around the world with vaguely pyramidal shapes. The Devil's Tower in Wyoming, the Matterhorn in Switzerland, Sugarloaf Mountain in Brazil. None of them are considered man-made. Nature can create geometry, they argued. Given enough time and the right conditions, erosion can produce shapes that look intentional, but are entirely random. But Osmanagic supporters countered with their own evidence. They pointed to the flatness of the faces, the consistency of the angles across all four sides, the precision of the cardinal alignment, which they argued couldn't be explained by random geological processes. They brought in geophysicists who used seismic testing to map the internal structure of the hill. The results showed distinct layers of material, some harder than others, arranged in patterns that looked more like construction layers than natural sediment. They found areas where the surface appeared to be covered with something resembling concrete blocks. Not modern concrete, but an ancient form of building material, harder than the surrounding stone. Samples were taken and analysed. The material contained a mixture of crushed stone and binding agents, similar to ancient Roman concrete or the geopolymer concrete theorised to have been used in pyramid construction. But critics dismissed these findings as well. They argued that natural minerals could create similar compounds, that what looked like artificial concrete might just be mineralisation, a natural process where groundwater deposits minerals that cement loose material into solid rock. The debate intensified. Each side brought more experts, more tests, more data. And through it all, the hill remained unchanged, silent, waiting for someone to prove definitively what it was. But then Osmanagit's team found something that couldn't be explained by geology alone, something that suggested intelligence, design, purpose. They found what lay beneath. Chapter 3. The Underground Tunnels. If the pyramid theory rested only on the shape of the hill, it might have faded into obscurity. Unusual geology, interesting measurements, but ultimately inconclusive. But then they found the tunnels, and everything changed. Just outside Visoko, buried beneath fields and forest, a network of underground passages had been known to locals for generations. They called them the Ravne Tunnels, named after the nearby Ravne neighbourhood. Old-timers remembered exploring them as children, crawling into dark openings in the hillside, following passages that seemed to go on forever. Most people assumed they were old mining shafts, medieval tunnels dug centuries ago to extract iron ore or clay, long abandoned and partially collapsed, filled with rubble and groundwater. Nobody paid much attention to them, until Osmanagit's team began clearing them. What they uncovered was far more extensive than anyone expected. The tunnels stretched for miles beneath the valley, not just a single shaft, but an intricate network of interconnected passages, chambers, and corridors. Some ran straight for hundreds of feet, others branched and turned, creating a labyrinth beneath the earth. The main passage was tall enough to walk through upright, 7 feet high in places, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The floor was relatively level, though covered in centuries of sediment that had washed in from collapsed sections. Other passages required crawling, narrow shafts that wound through the bedrock, carved or formed through processes no one could immediately identify. But what struck the excavators wasn't just the size of the tunnel system. It was the condition. The walls were dry. In underground passages, especially those running through sedimentary rock, you expect seepage. Groundwater percolating through cracks, moisture condensing on stone surfaces, dampness and mould and the constant drip of water. But these tunnels were remarkably dry. The walls in some sections appeared to have been deliberately carved or smoothed. Not rough and irregular like natural caves, but with surfaces that showed signs of tool marks or deliberate shaping. The ceiling in some chambers formed gentle arches, not sharp angles, but curves that distributed weight and pressure in ways that prevented collapse. And then there were the objects they found inside. Stone blocks, large rectangular slabs of a material different from the surrounding bedrock. Some weighed several tons. They were positioned throughout the tunnels, sometimes blocking passages, sometimes stacked along the walls. The blocks weren't rough, chunks of broken stone. They had defined edges, flat surfaces, uniform dimensions. Osmanagit's team examined them closely. The material appeared to be a type of conglomerate, harder and denser than the surrounding rock. But the way it was shaped, the uniformity of the blocks, suggested they had been cut or moulded rather than naturally formed. They found ceramic artefacts as well, fragments of pottery scattered through the sediment. But the styles didn't match known medieval pottery from the region. The forms were different. The clay composition was unusual. Some pieces were sent to laboratories for thermoluminescence dating, a technique that measures when ceramic materials were last fired. The results came back suggesting dates far older than the medieval period. And then there were the symbols, carved into the stone walls, etched into some of the blocks, geometric shapes, lines radiating from central points, patterns that resembled no known alphabet or decorative style from Bosnian history. Were they writing, mathematical notations, astronomical charts, religious symbols? Nobody knew. They didn't match Cyrillic or Latin scripts. They didn't resemble runes or Ogham or any European writing system. They looked ancient, purposeful. But their meaning was lost. Osmanagic proposed that the tunnels were not mines. They were access corridors, built by whoever constructed the pyramid above, perhaps to transport materials during construction, perhaps to serve a ceremonial function, connecting sacred spaces beneath the earth, perhaps to house treasuries or burial chambers that had long since been emptied or destroyed. He suggested that the tunnels might connect multiple pyramid structures across the valley, that what they were finding was just one part of a larger complex, an underground city or temple system, linking monument to monument. Critics argued otherwise. They suggested the tunnels were exactly what they appeared to be at first glance, medieval, mining tunnels dug centuries ago to extract ore or clay. The stone blocks could be natural formations that broke along cleavage planes, creating rectangular shapes without human intervention. The symbols could be scratches left by tools or markings made by miners indicating direction or ownership. The dry condition of the tunnels, they said, was due to the type of rock. The arched ceilings were natural formations where softer material had eroded away, leaving harder stone intact in curved shapes. Everything could be explained without invoking ancient pyramid builders. But the excavation team pressed forward. They cleared more passages. They mapped the network. They documented every symbol, every block, every artifact they found. And the question remained unanswered. If these were just old mines, why were they sealed? Why were they forgotten? And why did some sections appear to lead directly toward the base of the pyramid hill? The debate grew louder, more heated, more polarised. But one fact was undeniable. There was something beneath the valley, something old, something unexplained, and whatever it was, it had been there long before anyone currently alive. Chapter 4. The Energy Anomaly. Osmanagic was not content to argue geometry and geology. He wanted to explore a different possibility, one that would take the pyramid theory in a direction most mainstream archaeologists refused to consider. What if the pyramids weren't built as tombs or monuments to kings? What if they were machines? It's a theory that had circulated in alternative archaeology circles for decades. The idea that ancient civilizations understood energy in ways we've lost, that they built structures not just to honour gods or bury rulers, but to harness natural forces, to generate power, to communicate across vast distances. Nikola Tesla, a Serbian-American inventor, had proposed something similar in the early 20th century. He believed that pyramids, particularly the Great Pyramid of Giza, might have functioned as wireless power transmission stations, that their geometric properties and internal chambers could resonate at specific frequencies, channeling energy through the Earth itself. Tesla died before he could prove his theories. His notes on wireless energy transmission were seized by government agencies and classified. The technology, if it existed, was never fully developed or publicly revealed. But Osmanagic wondered, what if Tesla was right? What if the ancients had figured out something we're only beginning to rediscover? His team brought in researchers with electromagnetic detection equipment, engineers who specialised in frequency analysis, physicists willing to take measurements that most of their colleagues would consider pseudoscientific nonsense. They scanned the summit of the Pyramid of the Sun, looking for anything unusual, and they found something. According to their instruments, there was a concentrated electromagnetic frequency being emitted from the top of the hill, not a broad, diffuse signal like you'd get from natural background radiation, but a focused beam of energy pointing upward into the sky. The frequency measured at 28 kilohertz, a specific repeating signal, consistent, measurable, reproducible. The team took readings at different times of day, in different weather conditions, during different seasons. The signal remained. They moved their equipment to different locations around the summit. The strongest readings came from the highest point of the hill. The signal weakened as they descended the slopes. Osmanagic and his supporters theorized that the pyramid was designed to generate or channel this energy, that its geometric shape, its internal structure and its material composition were all engineered to create a resonant cavity, a chamber that could amplify natural electromagnetic frequencies and project them outward, perhaps as a form of wireless power transmission, beaming energy to other locations without wires or transmission lines, perhaps as a communication device, sending signals to other pyramids in a global network, perhaps as a healing technology, using specific frequencies to affect biological processes in ways we're only beginning to understand. They compared their findings to research on pyramid power, a controversial field that studies the supposed energetic properties of pyramidal structures. Some studies have claimed that objects placed inside pyramids experience unusual effects. Food stays fresh longer, metals resist corrosion, plants grow faster, water changes its molecular structure. Mainstream science dismisses most of this research as pseudoscience, poorly controlled experiments, and wishful thinking. But Osmanagic's team argued that the dismissal came too easily, that established science had a history of rejecting phenomena it couldn't immediately explain, only to accept them decades later when better technology made measurement possible. They pointed to examples: ball lightning dismissed as folklore until high-speed cameras captured it; meteorites, which scientists insisted didn't exist until so many fell that denial became impossible; continental drift, ridiculed for decades before plate tectonics became accepted theory. What if pyramid energy was the same, real but unmeasurable with current scientific instruments, or measurable but ignored because it contradicted materialist assumptions about how the universe works? Mainstream scientists were skeptical, deeply skeptical. They pointed out that electromagnetic readings can be affected by dozens of factors: underground water, which conducts electricity and can create localized electromagnetic fields; mineral deposits in the rock, particularly iron and magnetite, which can generate their own magnetic signatures; modern interference from nearby electrical infrastructure, cell towers, power lines, all of which emit electromagnetic radiation. The signal could be a natural phenomenon, groundwater flowing through iron-rich rock, creating a natural battery effect; piezoelectric activity, where pressure on quartz crystals in the stone generates small electrical charges. It could be measurement error, faulty instruments, operator bias, confirmation bias, where researchers see what they expect to see and ignore data that contradicts their hypothesis. It could be deliberate fraud, someone placing electrical devices at the summit to generate false readings. Though no one suggested Osmanagic himself was perpetrating fraud, the possibility of deception by others involved in the project couldn't be entirely ruled out. But the readings persisted. Other researchers visited the site with their own equipment. Some reported similar findings. They measured electromagnetic frequencies, ultrasound emissions, and ionization patterns that seemed unusual for a natural hill. Others found nothing. Their instruments showed only background radiation. Normal geological activity, nothing that couldn't be explained by conventional science. The energy question became another layer of the mystery. Because if the pyramid was emitting something, intentionally or not, it suggested the structure was more than decorative, more than a tomb, more than a monument built to impress or intimidate. It suggested purpose, function, engineering, and purpose implies design, and design implies intelligence, and intelligence 25,000 years ago implies everything we think we know about human history might be wrong. Chapter 5. The Age Problem. The controversy over the Bosnian pyramids took a sharper, more dangerous turn when Osmanagic's team began carbon dating material from the tunnels. Age was everything. If the structures were medieval, they were interesting but not revolutionary. Bosnia has a rich history of medieval fortifications, mines and settlements. Adding another site to that list would be noteworthy but wouldn't change our understanding of human civilization. If the structures were Roman or older, that would be significant. It would suggest that advanced engineering and monumental construction reached the Balkans earlier than currently believed. But if the structures were truly ancient, predating known European civilizations by thousands of years, it would shatter accepted timelines. It would prove that advanced cultures existed in Europe during periods when archaeologists insist only primitive hunter-gatherers roamed the continent. So the dating mattered enormously. Osmanagic's team collected organic material from multiple locations. Fragments of wood found embedded in stone blocks in the tunnels, charcoal deposits from sealed chambers, soil samples from layers beneath the pyramid's surface that hadn't been disturbed since they were deposited. They sent samples to multiple laboratories, reputable facilities with established reputations for accurate radiocarbon dating. They wanted results that couldn't be easily dismissed as amateur errors or contaminated samples. The results came back, and they were stunning. Some samples dated to around 5,000 years ago, roughly contemporaneous with early dynastic Egypt and the first cities of Mesopotamia. Significant, but not revolutionary. Other samples went further back. 10,000 years. 12,000 years. Deep into the period archaeologists call the Neolithic, when humans were supposedly just beginning to transition from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled agriculture. And some samples pushed even older. 15,000 years, 20,000 years, 25,000 years. If accurate, this would place human activity at the site during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of Europe and sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today. During a period when, according to conventional archaeology, no civilization existed anywhere on Earth. When humans lived in small nomadic bands, hunting megafauna and gathering wild plants, with no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no monumental architecture, no pyramids. Osmanagic embraced the results with the fervour of a man vindicated. He argued that the pyramids were evidence of a lost civilization, one that existed before the great cataclysms that ended the Ice Age. A culture erased by rising sea levels, climate shifts, and geological upheaval when the glaciers melted and the world transformed. He suggested that survivors of this civilization might have spread across the world, carrying knowledge of pyramid construction to Egypt, Mesoamerica and Asia. That the global presence of pyramids wasn't convergent evolution or independent invention, but inherited memory. Ancient refugees teaching their descendants how to build in stone, how to align structures with the stars, how to encode knowledge in geometry. The lost civilization hypothesis had been proposed before by writers like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval. The idea that an advanced Ice Age culture existed and was destroyed by catastrophe around 12,000 years ago, leaving only myths, legends, and scattered stone monuments as evidence of its existence. Mainstream archaeology had dismissed these ideas as speculative fantasy. Interesting stories, but unsupported by hard evidence. Now Osmanagic was offering dates that seemed to support exactly that scenario. But critics attacked the dating methods with equal fervour. They argued that organic material found near a structure doesn't prove the structure's age. Carbon dating tells you when a piece of wood or charcoal died, not when it was incorporated into construction. Wood fragments could have washed into the tunnels from surface erosion thousands of years after the tunnels were carved. Charcoal could be from fires set by medieval miners, or even earlier inhabitants using the tunnels as shelter. Soil samples could contain ancient, organic material that had nothing to do with pyramid construction. Contamination was always a risk. Groundwater percolating through rock could carry dissolved organic compounds from one layer to another, mixing materials of different ages and producing misleading dates. They pointed out that no artifacts had been found that definitively matched the proposed timeline. No tools specifically designed for quarrying or shaping massive stone blocks. No inscriptions, no burials, no human remains from 25,000 years ago directly associated with construction activity. Without those corroborating finds, the carbon dates were suggestive but not conclusive. Some critics went further, suggesting that Osmanagic was deliberately cherry-picking dates that supported his theory while ignoring samples that contradicted it. That medieval dates were being dismissed while anomalously old dates were being highlighted. Osmanagic denied this. He insisted all dates were being reported, that, The range of ages suggested a complex history of use and reuse over many millennia, that both medieval miners and much earlier builders had left their marks on the site. Independent researchers visited and conducted their own dating studies. Some confirmed similar age ranges, others found only more recent dates consistent with medieval activity. The debate became increasingly technical. Arguments over calibration curves, contamination protocols, statistical confidence intervals, the kind of specialised discussion that left most people confused and frustrated. But beneath the technical arguments, a simpler question remained. If the Bosnian pyramids are really 25,000 years old, where is everything else? Where are the settlements, the pottery, the tools, the bones of the people who would have built such structures? Proponents argued that sea level rise and climate change could have destroyed most evidence, that the builders might have lived in coastal regions now, underwater, that wood, rope, and organic tools wouldn't survive 25 millennia. Critics argued that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it's also not evidence of presence. That extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and the dating results, however intriguing, weren't enough on their own. The age question remained unsettled, but one fact was undeniable. The dates existed, recorded in laboratory reports, published in journals and conference proceedings. 25,000 years, numbers that refused to disappear no matter how loudly anyone objected. Chapter 6. Academic Backlash. By 2006, the Bosnian Pyramid project had attracted international attention. It had also attracted fury. The European Association of Archaeologists issued a formal statement condemning the excavations. They called the pyramid claims pseudoscience. They accused Osmanagic of damaging legitimate archaeological sites in the area, including medieval ruins, that were being disturbed by digging. Archaeologists from universities across Europe signed petitions demanding that the Bosnian government halt the project. They argued that promoting the pyramid theory was harmful to the country's credibility and to the discipline of archaeology itself. One prominent archaeologist called it the greatest hoax in archaeological history. Another compared it to ancient alien theories, dismissing it as entertainment masquerading as research. The criticism was personal, harsh, unyielding. Osmanagic responded by accusing the academic establishment of gatekeeping. He claimed that traditional archaeologists were protecting outdated narratives and refusing to investigate evidence that contradicted their models. He argued that institutional archaeology had a history of dismissing discoveries that didn't fit accepted timelines. That paradigm shifts only happened when enough pressure forced them to. He invited critics to visit the site, to examine the data themselves, to propose alternative explanations. Few accepted. The divide deepened. On one side, established science, defending the integrity of archaeological method. On the other, independent researchers, volunteers, and believers, insisting that something extraordinary was being ignored, and in the middle, the pyramids themselves, silent and unchanged, waiting for someone to prove what they truly were. Chapter 7. Why the Theory Won't Die. Most controversial archaeological claims fade. They burn bright for a moment, attracting media attention and passionate believers. Then the evidence fails to materialise. Funding dries up, public interest moves on, the claims are forgotten, relegated to footnotes in the history of fringe science. The Bosnian pyramids did not fade. Nearly 2 decades after Osmanagic's first announcement, excavations continue. Not at the frenetic pace of the early years, but steady, persistent, refusing to stop. Volunteers still arrive from across the globe, Europeans on summer holiday, Americans taking sabbaticals from careers in engineering and medicine, retirees with time and curiosity, young people searching for meaning in a world that often feels devoid of mystery. They come to dig, to explore the tunnels, to take measurements, to be part of something they believe is significant. Tourists visit Visoko by the thousands each year. The town has built an infrastructure around the pyramids, hotels, restaurants, tour guides who lead groups up the paths to the summit, explaining the theory, pointing out the geometric features, selling books and documentaries about the lost civilization hypothesis. The local economy has benefited. Jobs have been created. International attention has brought investment. Whether the pyramids are real or not, they've become real for the town's prosperity. The site has become something unique in archaeology, something that exists in a liminal space between accepted science and rejected. Pseudoscience, part archaeological dig, part spiritual pilgrimage, part conspiracy hotspot. People come because they believe in lost knowledge, in ancient wisdom, in the possibility that everything they were taught about history is incomplete or deliberately misleading. Others come because they're curious. They've heard the claims, seen the documentaries, read the books. They want to judge for themselves, to walk the tunnels, to feel the stone, to decide whether this is genius or madness. Some come because they want to challenge what they've been taught. They're tired of being told what to think by institutions they don't trust. Academia, government, media, the gatekeepers of official knowledge. The pyramids offer an alternative narrative. A story where official history might be wrong, where mainstream experts might be protecting their own authority rather than pursuing truth. That appeals to people, especially in an age where trust in institutions has eroded, where alternative information is easily accessible, where anyone with internet access can research topics that used to be controlled by academic specialists. The pyramid complex has expanded beyond the original Vysochika Hill. Osmanagit's team has identified what they call the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Dragon, the Pyramid of Love, and the Pyramid of the Earth. 5 major structures, they claim, arranged in a geometric pattern across the valley. Each one shows similar features to the Pyramid of the Sun: triangular faces, cardinal alignment, tunnels beneath or nearby, materials that might be ancient concrete. Critics dismiss all of them as natural hills. The same geological processes that could explain Vysochika, they argue, apply equally to the other formations. But the believers keep finding patterns, alignments between pyramid peaks that match astronomical phenomena, measurements that encode mathematical constants, geometric relationships that seem too precise to be accidental. Independent researchers conduct their own studies. Some support the pyramid hypothesis, publishing papers in alternative archaeology journals. Others remain neutral, acknowledging unusual features while refusing to commit to any conclusion. A few actively work to debunk the claims, visiting the site to gather evidence of natural formation. But the work continues regardless. Cameras document every new excavation. YouTube channels dedicated to ancient mysteries feature regular updates from Visoko. Podcasts interview Osmanagit and his team. Social media groups share theories, photographs, and speculative connections to other ancient sites. The digital age has amplified the pyramid story in ways that wouldn't have been possible in earlier decades. Information spreads instantly. Evidence, or what proponents call evidence, reaches millions of people without passing through traditional media gatekeepers. The question lingers, persistent and unanswered. If it's just a hill, why does it generate so much attention? Why do established scientists get so angry at the suggestion? Why does mere mention of the Bosnian pyramids trigger such visceral responses from mainstream archaeologists? Supporters argue it's because the evidence, while disputed, is compelling enough to warrant serious investigation. That the alignments, the tunnels, the measurements, and the energy readings form a pattern that can't be entirely dismissed as coincidence or delusion. That mainstream archaeology's refusal to engage, its tendency to ridicule rather than investigate, reveals something about the politics of knowledge, about who gets to decide what's real and what's not. Critics argue it's because people want to believe in lost civilizations, that the human mind is drawn to mystery and meaning, even when the simplest explanation is the truth. That conspiracy thinking offers psychological comfort, a sense of hidden knowledge, a feeling of being special by knowing what others don't. That entertaining obviously false claims wastes resources and damages the credibility of real archaeological work. Both might be right. Both might be missing something. But neither side has definitively proven the other wrong, and so the pyramids remain, neither fully accepted nor fully debunked, existing in the space between proof and faith, waiting. Chapter 8. The Lost Civilization Hypothesis. The Bosnian pyramids are not alone. Around the world there are structures that don't fit neatly into accepted timelines. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive stone temple complex dated to over 11,000 years ago, built by people who supposedly hadn't yet invented agriculture or writing. The Sphinx in Egypt. Some researchers argue its weathering patterns suggest it's far older than traditionally believed, possibly predating dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. Underwater structures off the coast of Japan, India and Cuba. Stone formations that resemble roads. Walls and platforms submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The Bosnian pyramids fit into a larger theory, the idea that a technologically advanced civilization existed before recorded history, that it flourished during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower and much of what is now underwater was dry land, that this civilization built monumental structures across the globe, pyramids, temples, observatories, networks of knowledge encoded in stone, and that it was erased by catastrophe, floods, earthquakes, climate collapse, events so devastating that only fragments of the culture survived, carried forward by scattered groups who passed down stories of a time before, a golden age now lost. There is no definitive proof of this civilization, but there are unsettling parallels. Pyramid structures on every inhabited continent, built by cultures with no known contact, using similar mathematical ratios, aligned to the same celestial markers. Flood myths in nearly every ancient culture, stories of a great deluge that wiped out an earlier world, advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics and engineering appearing suddenly in ancient societies with no clear developmental path. The theory asks, what if history didn't begin 5,000 years ago in Sumerian Egypt? What if it began much earlier, and we've simply lost the chapters that came before? Chapter 9. Silence, ridicule, and control. One of the recurring themes in the Bosnian pyramid story is the nature of the opposition. It's not just disagreement, it's active suppression. Media coverage of the pyramids often takes a mocking tone. Headlines frame the story as a joke. Documentaries focus on the controversy rather than the evidence. Funding for the project comes almost entirely from private donations and tourism. No major academic institution has offered support. Grants are denied. Applications for official recognition are ignored. Osmanagit's requests for collaborative research with established universities have been repeatedly refused. Critics say this is because the theory lacks merit, that no serious institution would waste resources on something so clearly disproven. But supporters see something else. They see a pattern of gatekeeping, a refusal to engage with evidence that challenges accepted narratives, a tendency to ridicule rather than investigate. They ask, if the pyramids are natural, why not study them and prove it conclusively? Why not send a team of geologists to map the site, run comprehensive tests, and publish definitive findings? Why not carbon date the organic material independently and settle the age question once and for all? Instead, the response has been dismissal, public condemnation, warnings to stay away. The conspiracy interpretation suggests that establishment institutions protect their authority by controlling the narrative, that acknowledging the pyramids as real would force a rewrite of history, undermining decades of academic work and threatening the credibility of entire fields. That curiosity is discouraged because curiosity leads to questions, and questions lead to doubt. Whether this interpretation is accurate or not, the result is the same. The pyramids remain in limbo, not proven, not disproven, officially ignored, and the people who believe in them continue to dig. Epilogue. The hills still stand. 2 decades have passed since Emir Osmanagic first looked at Vysochika Hill and saw a pyramid. The hill is still there, the tunnels are still being cleared, the measurements are still recorded, the energy readings persist, and the debate continues. No government body has officially recognised the pyramids as man-made. No major archaeological institution has endorsed the theory. The site remains outside the boundaries of accepted history. But it also hasn't been definitively disproven. Geologists can explain the shape as natural, but they can't explain every detail. The alignments, the tunnels, the stone blocks, the carbon dates. Osmanagic and his team continue their work, slower now, with less media attention but no less conviction. They believe they are uncovering proof of a forgotten chapter of human history, a civilization that built in stone, understood energy, and left traces across the world before vanishing into myth. Their critics believe they are chasing illusions, seeing patterns in randomness, bending evidence to fit a desired conclusion. Both sides claim to stand for truth, but the truth, as it often does, remains elusive. Because here is what we know for certain. There is a hill in Bosnia shaped like a pyramid. There are tunnels beneath it that no one can fully explain. There are measurements that align with ancient structures across the world. There are dates that suggest the site is older than it should be. And there are people who refuse to stop asking questions. If the hills are natural, time and science will eventually prove it beyond doubt. If they are not, history will have to change. Until then, the Valley of Stone Giants remains what it has always been. A mystery written in stone, a question without an answer, and a reminder that the ground beneath our feet may hold secrets we've only begun to understand. The pyramids are still there, waiting, silent, unchanged, and the people who seek the truth continue to dig.